One of the freedoms of being a humanistic rabbi is that I am not tied to the Torah portion of the week. I don't have to go Genesis, and then Exodus, and then Leviticus, and then more Leviticus, and then Numbers, and Numbers, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, until I plots. Fortunately, I'm free to choose other topics, and many weeks ago I chose this topic of turning the page, in keeping with the season, the time of year. But as I was putting together my thoughts, I thought, well, let me take a look. What is the Torah portion of the week this week? It turns out it's perfect for this topic. But it's not by design, it's simply by happenstance. In the Torah portion for this week, we hear about the fateful encounter between Esau and Jacob. Just to set the stage for you, Esau and Jacob are twins. Esau is born just a minute before Jacob, and therefore is the firstborn and has all the rights and privileges of being the firstborn, and Jacob is grasping at his heel even as they come out of the womb. There's wrestling even in utero and certainly afterwards as well. Jacob manages to deceive Esau into giving him his birthright for a pot of stew, and then Jacob deceives his father to receive the blessing of the firstborn, pretending to be Esau. And when Esau hears that, he goes mad. And he says, I'm going to kill Jacob. He swindled me out of my birthright, and he swindled me out of the firstborn blessing. I'm going to kill him. And Jacob's mother says, Jacob, it's time to leave, and sends him off to live with her family far, far away. Jacob eventually becomes successful. He marries a woman, and then he marries her sister because he went to marry the other sister. It's a whole story. He ultimately becomes the father of many, many people and very, very wealthy with all of the success that's been showered upon him. And he decides to move back to his homeland. But on the way, he hears his brother Esau is coming to meet him with a host of warriors. And Jacob doesn't know. What will Esau do? Is Esau looking to turn the page or to get revenge? Well, Jacob doesn't know. We have many New Years in the calendar. We obviously know of January 1st, the general New Year that's celebrated globally. We have a Chinese New Year that's marked in many communities with substantial Chinese populations. We have the beginning of a new school year, which for parents is sometimes the most wonderful time of the year. There's the Jewish New Year occurring in the fall, although if you read the book of Leviticus, the Jewish New Year originally began in the spring. It was later moved to the fall. Passover used to be the first holiday of the year and not Rosh Hashanah, which wasn't called Rosh Hashanah when it was not the beginning of the year. There are, of course, other New Years. There's tax year, fiscal years for accountants and businesses. You have your own personal New Year. It's called a birthday. Your couplehood, if you have a couplehood, has its own New Year called an anniversary. In theory, each one of these New Years gives us the opportunity for new beginnings. One idea I came up with some years ago for our family services at Rosh Hashanah was to take the idea of New Year's resolutions, but to apply them to Jewish life. But I felt waiting 12 months to check is too long. So I had the suggestion of writing a resolution, putting it in an envelope, and then take that envelope and put it in your box with all of your Hanukkah stuff. Because most families have a Hanukkah box that has the menorahs and decorations and plates and whatever other tchotchkes they happen to have. And that way it'd be like a 3-month check-in. You had your Rosh Hashanah, New Year's resolution. Let's see how you're doing around Hanukkah time. It's another chance to turn the page. And of course, it's also the end of the calendar year. And so we're thinking about new ideas and resolutions. Now, you don't need these New Years to plan out or to remind you to make a change. You could use Google Calendar and set a reminder for specific days and times from now until the end of time, or the end of the internet, whichever comes first. And just like having midnight in the middle of the night makes no sense for the start of a new day. I mean, why do we start the new day at midnight? It doesn't make any sense. January 1st for the new year, seasonally, doesn't make any sense. If you were doing a solar event like an equinox or a solstice, that would make more sense. Or even a seasonal change. You know, the Jewish calendar originally was in the spring, it moved to the fall. At least it was a change of seasons, not the middle of winter. Well, These are all answers to the wrong question, of course. Tonight, I'm not asking when do we turn the page, because you can turn the page whenever you want. It's how. How do we turn the page? Maybe we want to get past a personal failing, something that we didn't do as well as we had hoped, or we didn't live up to our own standards when we look back on it. Maybe we want to put an interpersonal conflict behind us so that we can move forward together in a continuing relationship. It could be that there's something in our deep past of memories, our deep background, that keeps gnawing at us, something that we keep coming back to, a pain that maybe current events brings to the forefront and just reminds us of it again and again, and we can't seem to get past it. Or maybe we just had a really bad year. You know, some years just stink. To quote Queen Elizabeth II via The Crown, an annus horribilis. And maybe we just can't wait to start something new, whenever, however we can put it together. I had a friend in college once, he said, sometimes on a bad day, I just end the day, I go to bed. If that means going to bed at 7 o'clock p.m., sometimes that's what I've got to do, because the next day, the sun comes up, you know, it's another day. So let me start by clarifying what turning the page does not mean, and then we can get to what it does mean. You know, like the sculptor that imagines a sculpture already inside the block of marble and they're just taking off what isn't the image. Turning the page does not mean forgetting. You know, short of a massive neurological failure, we cannot intentionally forget a negative experience. You can't just say to yourself, I never want to think about this again and I'm going to wipe it from my mind. It doesn't work that way. Now, 20 years ago, there was a movie that speculated maybe you could. It was called The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Really, actually, a really excellent movie. But if you watch it, you realize that that doesn't work well either. You try to go through and wipe out every corner of your mind of that negative experience of that person. Well, it leaves some holes. It erases part of yourself because your negative experiences help to make who you are, not just the good stuff. The most frequent commandment in the Torah is remember, zachor. Now, in Jewish life, sometimes we're commanded to remember things that didn't actually happen, like the Exodus from Egypt as described in the Torah, or the miracle of lights in Hanukkah season. The original stories of the Maccabees don't mention the miracle of lights at all. It's only the rabbis retelling the story several hundred years after the Maccabees that come up with the story of the miracle of the lights. But now, of course, everyone remembers that that's what happened. We can't forget the bad things, and so turning the page does not mean forgetting. Turning the page also does not mean forgiving, necessarily. Moving forward is not the same as an emotional release. You may never get the satisfaction you want from the other person or from the dynamic or from what happened in the past. It may be unfixable. It may be a relationship that you can't repair anymore. It's not necessarily trying to repair the dynamic so you can trust again or resume the friendship. Turning the page can be for yourself, within yourself. It may not always be outwardly directed. Turning the page also does not mean indifference, disconnect. Turning the page on something that doesn't mean anything. It's more than letting go of something that was important at one time but is no longer important. You know, my wife's resentment when she got clothing and her brother got a remote-controlled car one Hanukkah, it's old news. It's not worth carrying with you all the time. 2,000 years ago, it was a big deal that Jews could no longer atone for their sins through animal sacrifices at a Jerusalem temple, because the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed. There's a famous anecdote where two rabbis are lamenting the destruction, and one of them says, "What shall we do? How can we possibly atone for our sins?" And the other rabbi says, "Well, we have to make do with what we have left, study of Torah and good deeds, and that will have to suffice." But nowadays, if someone came to me who was interested in becoming Jewish and had read the Hebrew Bible, and I had to say to him, "That's wonderful, I'm glad you have that historical background, but I have to tell you, we don't sacrifice animals anymore," even though it says it in the Torah, I don't think they would be very disappointed. to not have the blood splashing and the animals lowing and all that. So if we're going to turn the page, it has to be something worth turning the page on. It's not something indifferent. If we're going to put effort and energy and attention and focus and emotional investment into something, it has to be worth it. And finally, turning the page does not mean suppression or denial, swallowing it, pushing it down. When I was an undergraduate, I took an intro to psychology class, and in the final, I got a point off on a question because they were asking for some of Freud's basic principles of human psychological function, and I couldn't remember the specific term, so I wrote motivated forgetting. Because you really don't want to remember. So you're motivated to forget. It's called repression. That's what they were looking for. That's the technical term. You know, Sigmund Freud had his flaws for sure, but he did have a profound insight into the problems that are created when you hide things, or you hide from things, when you avoid it, when you swallow that pain and that trauma, and you don't grapple with it and share it and face it. You know, Freud's master stroke was what he called the talking cure. That simply talking about it, getting it out, changed it, made it less scary. You know, it's like the monster in the closet, and then you turn on the light, and maybe it's not so bad after all. It may well be that you need to face the problem head on before you try to, just turning the page, it's still there, you know, it's going to bleed through the page. You can't turn the page unless you've dealt with the problem. Turning the page without dealing with it is not going to work. So if we are going to turn the page, how do we do it? Well, we have to do the opposite of suppression first. We have to do the work. You have to grapple with the real-life impacts of the problem, whether it was your failing and the effects that it had on other people, or it was a mutual dynamic and it's something that needs work with someone else, or even if you just want to apologize for your side of that dynamic. We have to process the emotional impact of the painful experience in ourselves as well. Simply swallowing it or ignoring it or trying to move past it without feeling what we need to feel. There's a reason why those feelings are there. We also have to have patience with ourselves because it may not happen all at once. You know, we might have a schedule. I want to be done with this in 3 minutes or 30 minutes or 3 days or 3 months, but it doesn't always work that way. We have our own emotional process. In Jewish tradition, there was a very prescribed and precise schedule for how to mourn. That you had the sitting of Shiva for 7 days, where you sat on those stools and covered the mirrors and wore certain clothing and tore things and didn't shave and didn't wash. And that was defined for 7 days. That's why it's called Shiva. Sheva in Hebrew means 7. So originally it was 7 days. I am mildly amused when people say, we're doing Shiva for 2 days. Because technically it's 7, but whatever. We know what it means. But then after the 7 days, you're supposed to get up off the low stools. You're supposed to wash yourself. You're supposed to go back to work and go back to synagogue and go back to your routines. And there were other mourning rituals that would wrap up after 30 days and then after 1 year. And if your parent died because of the dual commandment of honoring the dead and honoring your parents, you would do the 7 days for 30 and you do the 30 days for a year. So things would change. But the idea of prescribing exactly what you're supposed to do and exactly who's allowed to mourn, because after all, that rule of mourning only applied to certain relationships. And you weren't supposed to do it if it was your aunt or it was your cousin. Maybe you were closer with your cousin than you are with your sibling. We can't prescribe who you love or whose death affects you profoundly. And so to have a precise schedule, to assume it's going to work in a certain manner, in a certain timeline, that's, if not naive, maybe not compassionate. So the first thing we have to find for ourselves is doing the work, but having patience to do the work and patience to process as we need to. A second skill we need to acquire is to master acceptance. You've heard that famous serenity prayer? Now, I went down a little bit of an internet rabbit hole today, investigating the background to that prayer. It's often attributed to Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, but it turns out that it was first published in 1933 by the YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, periodical magazine called The Women's Press. It was written by a woman named Winifred Weigel, who had heard Niebuhr talk and had jotted down something in her diary. That's the first recorded instance we have, that he was talking somewhere, she jotted it down, and then she reworked it a bit, and she's the one who published it. But in later years, when she published it, she attributed it to him. My guess is because he was famous and she was not. But in any case, this is the origin story for this prayer, and it's something like this, that you're hoping for the courage to change what must be altered, the serenity to accept what cannot be helped, and the insight to know one from the other. Right? So, or often in a more concise version, the courage to change what I can, the serenity to accept what I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. And there's a wisdom in that statement, right? That we want to be brave enough to face, to turn the page on what we can, but sometimes we are not able to control everything. That's the quality of acceptance, that skill of acceptance. And turning the page sometimes means you're not going to get the resolution you want, and you have to be willing to move forward, even without it. Sometimes there really is nothing more that can be done on your part. Maybe the person that was mad at you is gone, and they're not there to apologize. You can apologize to the grave, but it's not the same, and it's not going to get you the resolution you want, and you're never going to get back the reciprocity that you had hoped for. Nothing will change the reality, and we have to live with it. We need to accept what is instead of continually focusing on what I wish had been. You know, we don't choose our parents, and they don't always choose who they are and how they interact with us, and we sometimes have to accept them for who they are and calibrate our expectations to the people they are, not the people we wish they might have been. I had a wedding couple once where the bride and the groom had done a lot to try to get the bride's father to come to the wedding. They had sent him an invitation, they had traveled to Florida to talk to him personally, and in the end, he did not come. And when I met with them about a month before the wedding, they told me this was the case, and they were hopeful that he would change his mind and come, and they reached out to him one more time. But on the day of the wedding, when I showed up, he was not there. And the bride was smiling and joyful because she said, I did everything I could do. I did everything that was reasonable and even beyond that, and this is a choice that he's made, but I'm not going to let it ruin my day. I'm going to have She was able to turn the page on that. Now that wound is there. She's not going to forget. And she may not forgive either. But she was able to move forward for herself on that day to celebrate and be joyful. And if you didn't know, that smile was as full as any other smile you would have seen. A third way to turn the page is to learn to make lemonade. You know the saying, if it's lemons, make lemonade. There's a traditional religious response to tragedy. It's all part of the plan. God never gives you something you can't handle. How lucky it is that you only broke both legs when you were run over in that crosswalk. Now, the humanist critique of that is maybe you didn't have to get run over in the first place. However, you know, part of our job as humanists is deducing what's the human need that's being met here. How is this psychologically adaptive that people in many cultures and places have come up with the same unsatisfying answer to the fact that something terrible happens? Well, maybe the human emotional response to the problem is that you want to make it meaningful. Even if you're stuck with something terrible, you want to make it meaningful, positive, something out of it that isn't just, this stinks. What lessons can you learn? Maybe I'll be more careful next time. Maybe I have empathy for other people who suffer. Maybe I understand some of the flaws in the medical insurance system. Maybe we can pass policies for safer crosswalks or longer walk times or other features that can help improve the situation. I wouldn't have chosen to get run over in order to do those goals. I could have thought of those independently, but maybe the way I make something better out of something terrible is by improving the world to make it less likely this happens to someone else. Maybe some good can come from this tragedy. You see, all these foundations for medical research that are named after people who suffered from that disease. That's because their families have said, something good has to come out of this, and maybe we can do more. Maybe we can do better. Maybe we can learn. Maybe someone else doesn't have to suffer the way that we did. 2 years ago, in July, Highland Park was struck with the plague of gun violence. And I found out some months later, as I was part of a clergy response group, that the mayor of Highland Park, within a day, was contacted by the mayors of other cities who had endured mass shootings. It turns out there's a manual that these mayors have developed for what to do after a mass shooting. And so she got the 120-page manual of what to do and what not to do and what the steps to best practices. That's not a skill that any mayor wants to get, or a knowledge base that they want to draw on. But I have to think, for those other cities, the fact that they had that knowledge, that they could share that resource, the fact that they could offer support and encouragement and empathy, made their tragedy a little less sharp, maybe? Or maybe they just felt a little more redeemed, that they could make something for someone else to help them out of their own tragedy and suffering. There is no virtue to suffering. There's nothing we gain from suffering in the world. But our wisdom, our insight, our courage can use our suffering as a motivation to make life better. And maybe that step helps us turn the page on the depths of our pain and take the next step. You know, you have families that lose a loved one in an accident, but they're able to donate the organs to help someone else. And when they can meet the person who lives, despite the fact that their loved one died, I think it gives them a kind of closure. It gives them a step forward. You don't forget. You don't let go. But maybe you can live your life a little more uplifted, knowing that you made something good out of something bad. And finally, we have to be open to new possibilities. Let's turn back to the book of Genesis and that Torah legend of Esau and Jacob. Jacob is prepared for the worst. Esau is coming with his armed forces, and the last Jacob heard, Esau was ready to kill him. And so Jacob prepares for the worst. He actually sends his wives and his children out ahead of him, just in case. He stays on the other side of the river, hoping to see Esau the next day. And as he sleeps, he wrestles with someone. Is it a god? Is it an angel? The voice of the person he's wrestling with tells him, you are no longer Jacob, Yaakov, you are now Yisrael. You are the wrestler with God. So maybe it is a divine encounter. But the truth of this encounter is revealed the next day. Because the next day, Jacob finally meets Esau. And Esau falls on Jacob's neck and embraces him, and they reconcile. And then Jacob says, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Who was he wrestling with? He was wrestling with his brother. He was wrestling with his own conflicted emotions about his brother and how they had wrestled with each other going back to when they were in the womb and were wrestling with each other even then. He was wrestling with the baggage of the past and his fear of the future. And what helps Esau and Jacob turn the page, even before they meet, is not psychotherapy. It's not monetary restitution or court-ordered mediation. It is their openness to trying again. And if they were not open, it would not have happened. And so that's the last stage for us. The key that opens the door to turning the page is being open to new possibilities. If we can't open ourselves to the possibility of something new, then we're never going to turn that page. So if you want to turn the page before the end of this year, at the dawn of this next year, for yourself or in relation to other people, then that will also be a key step for you too. Is there a possibility for new possibility? And if yes, then your finger has already grasped the corner of that page, and it's time to turn.